I run the UN Capital Development Fund in New York. We're one of the UN's anti-poverty agencies. In fact, we're the only bit of the UN that focuses exclusively on the needs of the world's poorest countries. I think that the UN could go head-to-head with Singapore in any contest on acronyms. This group of the world's poorest countries we call the least developed countries, or the LDCs. There are 49 of them in the world. Most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa, but even in this part of the world, which is relatively prosperous, there are countries like Laos and Bangladesh and Bhutan and Cambodia that fall into this category of least developed countries. The LDCs have very low incomes. They have very high rates of infant mortality and maternal mortality. They have very bad schools. They have very few clinics, very bad roads, and so on and so forth. They tend to suffer violent conflicts. They tend to be disproportionately affected by floods and typhoons and the like. In short, if you're a country, this is not the category that you want to belong to. So I suppose an obvious question is, what's the UN guy, what's the guy that spends most of his time worrying about malnutrition and the like, doing here today in Singapore in front of this audience? This is a primarily business audience. This is a very wealthy, dynamic capital. Singapore is in many ways, in more ways than one, a world away from my usual haunts. I'm going to try to answer that question of why I thought it was important to come here today by making three simple points. My first point has to do with the importance of economic growth for human welfare. Now, for much of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was a kind of schism within the international development community between those who believed that the overarching goal should be economic development and those led by Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen and others who believed that the overarching goal should be something called human development. That is, the expansion of human choices and freedoms that accrues when people have access to decent health care and decent education and the like, the basic building blocks that allow people to take choices over their own development and realize their own potential. Now, I'm simplifying, of course, but many of you will recognize within this debate, within this schism, the elements of the trickle-down theory of economics versus theories that target social as well as economic outcomes. The good news is that people in the international development community, in my community, have come to agree that human development is, in fact, the goal, and that we should measure progress in poor countries not only in terms of economic growth, but also in terms of whether individual lives are being improved. And that's the spirit behind what Philip referred to as the Millennium Development Goals. These are the 8 time-bound goals that have to do with human development that are that all of the countries in the world, in fact, have pledged to try to achieve by 2015, and that will be the subject of a World Leaders Summit in New York just 2 weeks from now. So you'll be hearing more about progress towards the MDGs. Yet even if we no longer talk only in terms of economic development, there's no denying that economic growth, healthy rates of economic growth, are almost a precondition for reaching these loftier Millennium Development Goals. Simply put, people in my business believe that growth policies should be designed to help poor people and that they should be environmentally sustainable, but we also fundamentally believe that growth matters and that it matters a great deal. This leads me to the second point, which has to do with trade as a driver of economic growth. I'm not going to belabor the importance of trade, particularly in front of this audience in this country. Singapore, almost like no other country, has reaped the benefits of global trade. As you all know, there's a very strong correlation between growth in income and growth in trade. This is both at the level of individual countries, but also globally, and particularly pronounced since the 1960s. It is, as you know, what is behind the rapid rise of many countries in this region. But the importance of trade as a driver of growth also has huge significance for those of us in the international development business. for a while, there is still much talk in the development business about the importance of official development assistance, or aid, as it's more commonly known. And we all think there should be more of it. The cold reality is that in the global war on poverty, trade is much more important than aid. Aid may have been the dominant capital flow to poor countries several decades ago, but it has long since been dwarfed by the private flows related to trade and investment. This brings me to the third point. If trade is more important than aid, what should be done to ensure that poor countries reap its greatest possible benefits? Now, ensuring that all countries benefit from international trade has long been a goal of global policymakers. This is what gave rise in the post-war era to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, or the GATT, and eventually to the WTO, as well as to the successive rounds of trade liberalization talks with which people in Singapore are all familiar. Despite the ongoing difficulties in bringing the Doha round to a successful conclusion, the establishment and maintenance of a liberal global trading regime has to stand out as one of the signal achievements of the post-war economic era. Yet developing countries, as is widely acknowledged, and especially the poorest amongst the developing countries, have largely been left out. This is partly because of the dynamics of global trade negotiations, but it is also because of the rather belated recognition that for poorer countries, trade policy is only part of the equation. In addition to the right trade policies, the right overall trade infrastructure needs to be in place for poor countries to engage in the global trading regime. Now, this means everything from ports and transport systems to customs procedures, security mechanisms, and everything that's needed for the trade system to work. It's the nuts and bolts for countries to engage. Trade infrastructure has definitely been the neglected part of the overall equation, and has in fact become the subject of a promising new area in international support called aid for trade. This area is considered promising because the economic literature suggests that while all countries would benefit from more efficient global trade and a more efficient global trading infrastructure, poorer countries would benefit disproportionately. So this brings me full circle to my original question of why I am here. The efficiency of the global trading system matters, and it matters a great deal to poorer countries struggling with the high costs of trying to break in. As I said, there's the question of hard infrastructure, such as ports and shipping facilities and so on, but it's also a matter of the soft infrastructure, the documentation, tracking, and security systems that lubricate the overall trading regime and that the Human Wealth Program is targeting for efficiency gains and cost reductions. Anything that reduces the cost of global trade and makes the entire regime more efficient is of great interest to those of us concerned with bettering the lives of people in poor countries. So that's why someone who spends most of his days thinking about malnutrition and getting kids in school and the like was keen to come to Singapore today and join in the discussions that we're going to have this afternoon. I think that the program that you're about to hear about is a big idea at a time when such ideas are sorely lacking, and I, for one, look forward to learning more. Thank you very much.